Hello and welcome to episode 110 of the Reds Unrestricted podcast. I'm your host, David Comerford, and I'm joined by Dan Clubbe to discuss Liverpool's 1-0 victory over Wolves. So, yeah, finally some positive vibes on the podcast. Finally, some positive vibes with Liverpool. Harvey Elliott's first half goal, giving the Reds a 1-0 victory on the road at Molineux to book a place in the fourth round of the FA Cup, where they will be back at the Amex Stadium to face Brighton, who obviously gave them quite a beating last weekend. So an opportunity for maybe less revenge, but more redemption, you'd say. So we will start, as usual, with our post-match podcasts with a three-word match review. And I will go first on this one before I bring Dan in. And Dan, my theory on this is back to basics. And it was the phrase that Klopp used after the game against Brighton at the weekend. He said, we have to go back to basics. And I thought Liverpool did that in a few important ways last night. I think, first and foremost, the press. And I think that was particularly pronounced in the first half. Um, we saw Liverpool really pushing up higher and crucially pushing up as a unit. You know, you had the front line, but the midfield was stepping in there too. And the amount of times they forced errors from Wolves, the amount of times they won the ball back, it was much more like a vintage Klopp team. And I think the moment that summed it up really was when Jose Sarr was given the ball by one of his defenders. And his only option with all the angles closed off was to actually knock it behind and concede the corner. And you rarely see that. But that is a testament really to just how effective Liverpool's pressing play was on the night. So I was really pleased to see that return. And hopefully we can obviously preserve it going forward, because it just shows you the difference that it can make when you have that kind of structure and that discipline in your midfield shape. And I also thought, Liverpool were really good in possession, particularly in the first half. They had spells where I thought their passing play was kind of at its most cohesive for a good while, which was surprising given the extent of changes and that some of these players just haven't really played together at all. But also, I guess, the fight at the end of the game. I think you were there, Dan, and I'm sure the fans appreciated it really, sort of battling spirit at the end of the game, because Wolves were putting us under pressure. And I was reading Klopp's comments this morning. He wasn't too happy with Liverpool dropping quite deep at the end of the game. But in those circumstances, they defended their box with the kind of a lot of battle and spirit. And given that this is a team who, rightly or wrongly, have faced criticism for a lack of maybe application and being outfought by the other team at times, that certainly didn't happen last night. And they kind of gave everything to make sure that they were going to come away with a win. And I think overall, to kind of tie everything together, this was the first time since the World Cup that Liverpool have not only won a game, but deserved to win it. And that was really satisfying to see, because the previous couple of wins we've had, there's been kind of concerns. But like I said at the start, good vibes, because it was not only a win, but also a performance, and that was sorely needed. But what are your three words, and what did you make of the performance last night then?
Yeah, so my three words are going to be Stefan Bajcetic masterclass. I thought he was phenomenal. I thought he was phenomenal in the ground watching, and I thought he was phenomenal when I watched the highlights back this morning as well. He was perfect all night, really. I don't want to sort of heap too much praise on just that individual performance, because as a collective, we were so much better than we have been in recent weeks. You summed it up really well. It was everything that's been missing, really, since the World Cup. It had intensity, it had passion, it had that desire. But also, aside from that, it wasn't just about running around a lot more and pressing. It had quality when we did win possession, and it had those fighting spirits that just haven't been there. When we were winning our first challenge, we were winning our second challenge. It was just everything we've come to expect from a Liverpool side, but haven't been seeing in recent weeks. And as well as that, not to go over your points too much again, but it was streetwise, it was smart. Too often in recent weeks, we've been making life easy for the opposition. There have been a few instances with a few players, I won't single players out in this instance, have let opposition sort of go beyond them and not fouled them, not brought them down, and it's meant that we're in trouble. Like, our defence is exposed. That wasn't happening last night. And as much as I want to laud Bajcetic in his performance, James Milner was probably the catalyst behind that. He started that. He was like, no, if we're in trouble, I'll bring him down. I'll risk that yellow card just if it means that we're not going to concede or not concede a big chance. So, yeah, it was so much more like it. And you're right to sort of reference the changes and how it was quite surprising how cohesive and how as a unit they were, given, like, I'm not sure, I'm not privy off the top of my head, but I would be surprised if that 11 has played together before now. Well, certainly with Gakpo, it definitely won't have done. But it was just a brilliant performance to a man, really, from the outset. And some players there's some big question marks over, including Joe Gomez. Outstanding. That was much more like it.
Yeah, Gomez as well deserves praise for his performance. He defended pretty brilliantly throughout that game. I think that the point about winning challenges is crucial. You know, Klopp's talked about that so much recently in the sense that when Liverpool commit so many players to a half-hearted press and then that inevitably gets bypassed, then that's when you see in the kind of situations where they look really exposed. And those obviously become all too common this season. And on the Streetwise angle that I saw a tweet just before we came on this morning, and Dan Morgan from the Anfield Wrap was saying that was the best Liverpool have fouled all season. And I'd have to agree with that. I think, you know, it was kind of that extra element of guile in there, and, you know, it really frustrated Wolves. But the best thing about it, I think, was that they were fouls that the referee couldn't necessarily give a yellow card for a lot of them because the kind of counter attack wasn't in full flow. So I thought that was kind of maybe an underrated element to the performance too, that Liverpool were a little bit more they weren't as naive maybe as they've been at times in other games. But if we move on to kind of the individuals then, and you obviously touched on Bajcetic already, but rather than maybe looking back at the performance last night too much, then, like, I mean, from my perspective, I think he really grew into it as it went on, and he the amount of challenges he was winning, and his growing confidence, and that moment as well where he kind of lets the ball run past him and leaves the opposition player on the ground with shade to Thiago. You know, these were all really good features of it. But if we kind of look ahead, do you see him as someone who's a serious Fabinho challenger? I mean, he is still very young. I think they said in the commentary last night that it was only his third start for Liverpool still. Do you see him as like a genuine competitor, or is it still is he still a little bit too far away to put serious pressure on Fabinho?
Well, I think he has put serious pressure on Fabinho based on that performance last night, to be honest. But more generally, I think he should be too far away, and he should be too young, and he should be too inexperienced to be a candidate for that role. I believe he will play a part, but for me, his part should still be in the FA Cup and maybe sort of at the back end of football matches when they're already won. Like, as brilliant as he was last night, and I used him in my 3-word review because I thought he was outstanding. Honestly, I thought everything about his game, his reading of the match, his understanding of where to be, and the way he dealt with every situation. And he went down with cramp and he could barely walk at one point, let me tell you. I don't know if the TV cameras picked it up, but he got himself back up, and he even dealt with a couple of situations after that. He was genuinely outstanding. But on the flip side of that, I think if we are going to sort of add him into the rotation of the midfielders in terms of starting football matches, that's a big leap. And you don't want to you could hold him back in a sense if you do throw him into a game and he does get overrun for whatever reason, has a bad 45 minutes, whatever it may be, it could knock his development back a couple of stages. That's the last thing we want with somebody so wonderfully talented. There's a lot of outcry now based on last night for him to start against Chelsea. Now, I'm fully aware Chelsea aren't in the greatest moment, much like us. But if we do start the youngster against Chelsea and it doesn't go well for him, what does that mean for the future? I don't agree with that personally. I think he's a brilliantly talented player who we should be including, but at the right moments. And I'm not sure that's starting big Premier League games just yet.
Yeah, I agree with you. To be fair, I think it's a little bit premature to talk about, you know, Premier League matches, or certainly Premier League matches of that magnitude. I think there are still some moments where he doesn't look completely ready for that, and that's not a problem at all. You know, given, like I say, how little experience he does have. Maybe we can look towards that next season. I think one interesting thing is that, you know, the club have been linked with a lot of defensive midfielders. But how does Bajcetic kind of complicate that? You know, because if you bring in, say, a 22-year-old Fabinho backup, then that's his first team path block. Then realistically, and maybe he fits in a little bit further forward, but he does look good in that number 6 role. So I think that is what he's doing. He's more putting pressure on the club from a transfer standpoint than he is maybe on Fabinho just yet. I think is another way you can look at it. But a couple of the other players from yesterday, Harvey Elliott, man of the match, according to the BBC. Played at right wing. Is that his best position?
That's such a difficult one. I've been having this conversation so often over the past few days because it was only a matter of 6 weeks ago that every Liverpool fan you speak to would say, "Oh, he can't play right wing because he's not quick enough," and they just dismiss it just like that. All of a sudden, he, as well as the entire midfield department, had a tricky period of time playing in the midfield for Liverpool, and he can't play in the midfield either. I still think he is that very attacking 8, hybrid 10 type of thing in the midfield, because I do think in a Klopp system in particular, the pace is a huge issue, and there's no doubt about it. When he gets one-on-one with his fullback, he hasn't got the pace or even the trickery necessarily to beat his fullback and to go, and that's no slight on him. I adore the lad. I think he's a brilliantly talented player, but he hasn't got that extra yard of pace just to knock it and go like a Mohamed Salah or a Sadio Mane or a Luis Diaz. So I still think he is that 10-8 type of role that I spoke about. But what a goal. I mean, the best screamer of the night on the BBC, and there's a couple knocking around. So I believe. Yeah, but I was made up for him as well, because he had a lot of criticism about the midfield stuff that I was talking about. And you could tell how much it meant to him to score the goal and then ultimately get the winner at the end. His celebrations were outstanding. So, yeah, delighted for him. Like I said, I do think he will end up being that midfield. I just don't think the wing is for him, and it's in different systems for different managers who like that inverted winger that cut in all the time. I sort of reference Arjen Robben in a sense that he was just cutting in all the time on his left foot and going. Maybe it would work, but we don't play that way, so it doesn't suit.
Yeah, you need to be able to go down the outside. I think it's good to have a winger who can kind of, you kind of got this with Gakpo as well. I think generally in your squad, it's good to have different types of players so you can kind of use it in certain games where the opposition might be more vulnerable to it. I think there are definite issues with suitability there. One thing I would say is the defensive side of the game. I think he much prefers it on the right, because I think it's a more simple task. He's got less space to cover. He's still expected to get back and support his fullback from there, which I think he will do happily. The issue's never been application in terms of defensive side. It just looked more comfortable when his role was more defined off the ball. So I thought that as well, in addition to how good he was. And I think the element that he kind of gives you off the right is kind of coming in and linking up with the forward. And I think we saw that a couple of times with Gakpo yesterday. And that is something you maybe could explore, but you are right, Dan, that in terms of the conventional Klopp winger, he is kind of neither here nor there. And I would love to see him, much like I'd love to see Carvalho, use it as a number 10. But again, we don't really have that space in our system at the moment. So it's a bit of a dilemma. But one thing I will say is, a lot of people have been so critical of Harvey Elliott this season. I just think he deserves more respect from the fan base. Everyone's looked at this kind of 19-year-old player who's learning on the job, to be honest, when it comes to the defensive aspects of a midfield role. It's not his fault that Liverpool have neglected their midfielders enough to kind of have him in there while he's in that learning process. And, you could easily forget, looking at Liverpool's Twitter feed, that this is one of the most talented young players in the Premier League. And we spent so much time looking at what he can't do rather than what he can. And last night was a reminder of that, certainly. So I was really pleased for him. And yeah, his passion is obvious, to be fair. You can see what it means to him when the final whistle goes, when he scores, things like that. So it's great to have that feature as well. There were obviously a few other players that stood out. We mentioned Gomez earlier. Thiago completely ran the show in midfield as well, but that's just kind of standard fare for him, and he certainly benefited from the improved midfield structure. But let's spend the final few minutes on Chelsea at the weekend, Saturday 12:30 kickoff. What have you made of Chelsea, Dan? Because it's been like Liverpool have struggled, but it's the one thing that's been a consolation is that another of the so-called Big Six teams has actually been fair and worse in Chelsea. And if you look at the table now, 9th and 10th in the Premier League. Why do you see the reason in terms of why it's got so bad for Chelsea under Potter.
Yeah, I can think of another consolation, Dave. To be honest, it's a little bit further down the table, but no, as for Chelsea, at least they're not throwing money at the problem. That's the main thing. Crazy, absolutely crazy. It's a difficult one. I think the chaos that surrounds our football club is probably sort of showing on the pitch a little bit. There's no stability there, it seems. I think Todd Bowley, I'm not going to sort of criticise him and what he's doing, but he is kind of getting it together now, it seems, in terms of the backroom staff and all that kind of element. But it took a while, and I think that has probably had an impact on the pitch. And Graham Potter spoke the other day, and about the Mudryk signing, and you just could tell it wasn't his signing. I can't remember his exact words, so I'm not even going to paraphrase. But everything about his interview was like, "Oh yeah, I sort of discovered we were signing." It was like that doesn't ring very true or very great. It's not a great sort of endorsement for what's going on in that football club if the manager doesn't want the player to begin with. So it's an interesting setup there, but more generally, more focused on the pitch. They just haven't got it right, have they? They're throwing a lot of sort of players at the problem and they can't seem to find the system that works. And Potter, he's kind of taken some of the issues that he had at Brighton with him in terms of actually scoring goals. He's struggling to find the chemistry and the way to make his side. Yes, they can be very attractive to watch at times. They can be very sort of nice and sort of balanced and cohesive, and they keep the football really well. And up until a point, up until sort of the final 18 yards, it's kind of great. And then all of a sudden it kind of breaks down. So I think they're struggling with those sort of issues. And I actually felt at the time that it was a big leap for Potter. Because he had a good thing going at Brighton. Not as good as it is now under De Zerbi. Obviously, he's took them on to another level, which kind of shows some of Potter's deficiencies potentially as well. But I thought it was a big job for him. I felt he's actually gone too soon, if I'm going to be brutally honest. Because Chelsea, especially given what had happened with the ownership, nobody quite knew what that looked like. So for Potter to go into that world felt like a risk to me. And given the pressure that he's under now, all the noises are that they are giving him in time and they're going for a youth policy, etc., etc. But how long that lasts remains to be seen. If they finish 9th, 10th like they're in now, then who knows what happens next season or during the summer. So they're a difficult club. They're a bit of a basket case club in many senses, Chelsea. I never quite know what to make of them, particularly right now because of how new everything is. But I'm never convinced Potter was the man for that job, and I'm even less convinced now.
I think, they talk about giving Potter time, but the nature of what's going on at that club, everything does seem to be, certainly with the recruitment, I think, and the way they had a record spend last summer and then sacked Tuchel so quickly. I'm not sure, they can pretend to have such a cohesive long-term plan. It wouldn't be a surprise if they just kind of ditched that. I personally think they should give him time. I think he's shown enough as a manager, maybe not necessarily at Chelsea, even if he did have a good start, but at Brighton to merit being that kind of young manager who's given that faith, given that time. And he drew a comparison recently in a press conference to Arteta and to Klopp, even to Guardiola, who only finished third in his first season, quite a long way off in terms of being a title contender. I think a lot of managers will make that comparison, especially with Arteta, who felt like on the verge of being sacked at times with Arsenal.
Yeah.
It's not going to be valid for every manager, but for him, I do think it is, and I do think Chelsea should persist with him because I think the rewards there if he can, I guess, he chops and changes the system so much. But if he can hit on something that works there, I think that they can be a real force genuinely, and but they are having to put up with a lot of early pain, which I think is a lot due to injuries. Reece James hasn't played too much this season, and he's an absolutely vital player for them. He's arguably their most important, and we've seen a lot of 11s going around recently of these are players that Chelsea have unavailable. And on that point, I'm quite glad we don't have to face João Felix because I think he's a player who could cause us big problems potentially. Obviously suspended for this game. So yeah, I do see there being kind of some valid excuses for him. To be fair, so I'm not going to judge him too harshly just yet. I think the only team with more injuries than Chelsea this season, if you look at matches missed, is actually Liverpool. So these two teams can kind of maybe have a little bit of sympathy for each other in that regard. But speaking of personnel, how do we think Liverpool should line up? Rather than kind of listing the full 11, I think let's just focus on kind of the main selection dilemmas because We know it's obviously going to be Alisson in goal. He'll be coming back. Trent, Matip, and Robertson will probably come back as well into the defence. Fabinho will presumably return. Salah from the start. Nunez should be back fit, and then, given the lack of options, probably Gakpo on the left. So the real question mark, I think, is that right centre midfield position. I think that Keita has to start ahead of Henderson. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. It actually pains me to say it in many senses because of what's happening with Naby Keita. I think we all know the writing's pretty much on the wall. I think the latest report about his contract they've tried and they failed, so it's not going to happen. So the writing's on the wall in terms of his future. So in so many senses, every part of my being says, well, don't play him. Well, just don't play. If he's going at the end of the season, don't play him. Unfortunately, we're not really in a world or position whereby we can afford to do that. It's a results business, and God only knows that Liverpool need results right now. If they're going to do anything of any sort of sufficiency in the Premier League, we need to get results, and it needs to start on Saturday. So I think Naby Keita has to start the game. Yeah, I do. Jordan Henderson's form, he could probably do with being left out for a little bit longer, if truth be told. I don't think it's he's gone or he's finished, like a lot of people seem to be suggesting. I just think he's exhausted. I think he's absolutely exhausted. His performances, he hasn't been able to do anything that we know and love about Jordan Henderson. So you've got to keep going with Keita, and you've got to go with Thiago alongside him, because that midfield three should be our best potentially in terms of balance. I'd say Keita, Thiago, Fabinho, in terms of qualities and what they all bring to the table. I think that is almost the ideal three we've got available to us.
Yeah, I've been wanting to see that midfield for a while, and I think Saturday could be the time. But that'll wrap us up for this episode. Cheers for jumping on, Dan. We'll be back after that Chelsea game at the weekend to discuss that one. Obviously, huge for Liverpool in terms of trying to revive any sort of top four ambition that they do have and building on this performance against Wolves. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed the podcast, there's plenty of things you can do. You can subscribe. You can give it a 5-star review. That would be much appreciated, or a positive review on any other podcast platform that you might use. And yet we're also uploading the podcast to YouTube now as well. So you can see you can see us in the flesh doing the podcasts. And if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel as well, as we try to grow that, that'd be great. And yeah, if you press the notification button either on YouTube or on Spotify, you'll obviously get a message every time we release a new episode. But yeah, that's all the admin dealt with. So we will see you again shortly for our post-Chelsea episode. But yeah, until then, take care.